order. I'm Roy Miller, serving as chair. I'm from the state of Delaware. So welcome to the Shark Board meeting this afternoon. You have an agenda. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda? Seeing none, I'm assuming it's approved. The proceedings from the May 2017 meeting, that was the most recent meeting of the Shark Board. Are there any additions or corrections to those proceedings? Seeing none, I'll assume they're approved as they're printed before you. At this time, I'd like to call on public comment. As is our custom, this would be for items not specifically on our agenda. Did we have a sign up?
No, we signed up, but we are indicating that one person wants to.
There is one person who would like to offer public comment. Would you please step forward and say your name, please, and your affiliation?
Hi, yes, this is actually for an item that is on the agenda. Will that be after the agenda item is addressed? Okay, I'll hold off then.
That would be the best time to address it then.
Thank you.
Just remind me when we get to your agenda item. All right, next on our agenda, we're going to go over the final rule for highly migratory species, Amendment 5B. Dusky sharks, and to lead off this discussion concerning the review of the final rule and NOAA Fisheries request for complementary measures, I'm going to call on Carol Brewster-Geis. Carol?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For those of you who don't know me, I work for NOAA Fisheries in the Highly Migratory Species Management Division. If you remember last spring, I gave a presentation about the final rule and requested for complementary measures then. I believe the Commission decided to think about it, to review what the states wanted, and then we're at this stage now where NOAA Fisheries at least is hoping for the Commission to take on and implement some complementary measures for Amendment 5B. So I have a very quick presentation where I will explain the background of Amendment 5B, what we finalized, the implementation status of those measures, and then our request for complementary measures. So if you remember, this is all regarding dusky sharks. It is a ridgeback shark found along the coast. The stock assessment found they were overfished and experiencing overfishing, and a mortality reduction of 12% was needed to end overfishing immediately, and an additional reduction, so total reduction of 35% is needed to rebuild the stock by 2107. That is not a typo, it's not 2017, it's 90 years from now, 2107. So we have a bit of work to do to reduce fishing mortality by 35%. Our final rule published last April, and then I presented that to the Commission in May. So one of the final measures we had was requiring that all recreational permit holders obtain a shark endorsement, and this shark endorsement would allow you to fish for and catch and land sharks, not just dusky sharks, but any sharks. So this will be required as of January. It is something that you can get when you apply for your HMS angling, HMS charter headboat, or a couple other permits. You watch a video that is up on our webpage. You can look for it on YouTube or Vimeo or any of the other places. It's about 2 minutes long. It goes through how to identify dusky sharks and other ridgeback sharks, how to safe handle and release them so you do not injure the shark, nor do you injure yourself. It also talks about the circle hook requirements and the recreational regulations. In addition to this shark endorsement, we have updated Our shark identification placard, if you remember, this is on waterproof, tear-proof paper for anyone. We hand it out to tournaments who request it. Anyone can get them. I have a couple copies up here. We created a prohibited shark identification placard that has the prohibited species, particularly ridgeback sharks, which is what we're focusing on. And on the back has handling and release techniques. And we also updated our careful catch and release guide. And this guide goes through how to release not just sharks, but other HMS, including billfish and tunas and swordfish. So all of this is underway, and we've been getting really good response so far in the placards, the careful catch and release guide, the video. We've undergone beta testing for the quiz that people will need to take the shark endorsement. We've made some tweaks to the video, so the new video will be available with the quiz. And those tweaks were more focusing on the safety requirements. You do not have to use a dehooker, but we do ask everybody to release the shark with a minimum amount of gear. The other measure we have for the recreational fishery is requiring circle hooks. The circle hook requirement is for anywhere south of Chatham, Massachusetts. And that's pretty much the northernmost range of dusky sharks. Some of the research, particularly that by Angel Willie and Mark Sampson in Maryland, showed that circle hooks do have a very positive impact on fishing mortality. It reduces it by quite a lot. So we have really begun outreach on this, and it is all in our outreach materials. Commercially, we are requiring that all fishermen with a limited access permit and pelagic longline gear need to release sharks that they are not planning on keeping by using a dehooker or by cutting the gangin less than 3 feet from the hook. Again, all of our pelagic longline fishermen are trained in how to use a dehooker, but if they deem it unsafe to do so, given the activity of the shark, they need to cut it with a minimum amount of gear. And this minimum amount of gear is more of a common sense effort to try to minimize fishing mortality so that shark, when it's released, has the opportunity to survive, thus reducing fishing mortality. We also implemented how to do this and how to identify sharks for our commercial fishermen by having a new shark segment in our safe handling and identification release workshops. These workshops were already required. We are now including a new segment on shark identification. We have increased dusky shark outreach and awareness tremendously. We've included some more commercial outreach materials and require all pelagic longline, bottom longline, and shark gillnet fishermen to abide by dusky shark fleet communication and relocation protocol. What this means is if they catch a dusky shark, they need to let other vessels in the area know there are dusky sharks in the area, and they need to move 1 nautical mile once they pull up their gear to try to get away from the sharks. This is the same requirement we have when it comes to marine mammals and sea turtles, so we again felt this was a common sense measure to try to move away from the dusky sharks. And then the last alternative we have for them is requiring the circle hooks in bottom longline gear. We already require circle hooks for sea turtles in the pelagic longline fishery. Now we will be requiring it in the bottom longline fishery as well. This slide, I'm not expecting you to be able to read it. It is just a summary of all of that. All of these measures are already in effect, some of those commercial measures, or will be in effect come January 1st. And then this is our request that you help us with the outreach and education and provide links to some of our materials or create your own materials. That you collaborate on development of best practices for the handling and release of sharks when shore or pier fishing. Again, all of our handling and release is from the vessel because we are in federal waters. We are really looking to the states to drive the development of best practices up and down the coast, so all fishermen know how to release sharks when they catch them from that pier or on the beach. We are also asking the states to consider requiring circle hooks in your various hook and line fisheries. So this could be your recreational fisheries, but it could also be some of your commercial hand gear or commercial short lines. We are asking that you require fishermen to maximize gear removal before releasing sharks. This doesn't mean they have to use dehookers, but maybe just cutting with as much gear as possible, or rather the least amount of gear as possible, remaining on the shark. And then also consider cooperative research with us to improve estimates of duskies. We talked a lot about that at the technical committee last time, have had some conversations with various states, so I think we're moving forward somewhat on that, but if you haven't started thinking about it, it would be good. Again, all of these measures, all of the measures we implemented are needed in order to reduce fishing mortality on dusky sharks by 35%. We really need all of the states to help with this in order to end overfishing and rebuild this species. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Are there questions or comments relative to Carol's report? In the back, Pat.
Carol, thank you very much for that. I'm just kind of curious, how have the measures that have been in place since June been received by the commercial fishery? I mean, they've had about 4 months so far. You know, what are you hearing from the commercial sector?
The commercial sector has not come back saying that these are unreasonable requests. They are already taking the course in the workshops. They've been doing that since June. For the most part, it's good. We've gotten some questions back from the workshops, so we might be making some changes to that presentation that they give. As far as I know, things are going well with the commercial fleet and the measures that are already in effect.
Are there any other questions or comments? David Bush.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question for you. On the previous slide, I think it was, where it said these final measures will end overfishing. Is that based on what is already or what has already been implemented, and anything the states do above and beyond that is additional, or is this with the assumption that the states will have complementary measures?
To end overfishing, we needed a 12% reduction in fishing mortality. And we felt that the commercial measures that are already in place or went into place on June 5th would have achieved the 12%. We also believe that with the states on board, we can reach that 35% that is needed to rebuild the stock.
Any other questions? We'll proceed to the next item, and that is the Law Enforcement Committee report. And for that, I'm going to call on Doug Messick from Delaware, who is representing the Law Enforcement Committee today. Doug?
Thank you. We'll be breezing over real quickly, and thank you for the opportunity to come here and speak to you all today. Will be the memo from a conference call that we had several months back. What we reviewed and we discussed was some of the implementations that we're going to go over. And under the federal orders, the LEC did agree that the online training, video, and questions had merit, but it would provide some difficulty to enforce. What we are recommending at this time is continue using using this as an outreach and educational tool, and also extend this over to enforcement officers up and down the coast so that they also have the training and being able to identify the sharks. The possession requirement of carrying some certification, if you have that on board, individual person, that would be able to be used, that would be adequate for enforcement purposes, but it would have to be something that's consistent amongst all the states so that we would know what we're looking for in the federal orders. Discussion of implementation into the state orders on this. It was our recommendation that this somehow be combined to the HMS permit, so that when you received your HMS permit, you took the online training, and then that became part of the general HMS that was distributed. However, we did realize that would not take into account the shore fishermen and the beach anglers and the pier anglers who do make up a large part of this. As far as the recreational for the non-offset and non-stainless with the circle hook requirements, that does prove very difficult for enforcement purposes because it comes down to targeting. It will take a lot of personnel hours to sit there to watch these folks, to know exactly what they're fishing for, and being able to ascertain that, yes, they are targeting sharks, they are catching them, and they are doing this. That will be very time-consuming, very hard to enforce. Several states already have circle hook requirements in for striped bass. They are effective, but they are very time-consuming, and they are hard to enforce. Once the person leaves that area, if they have the sharks on board and they have left that area, at that point, you're not able to ascertain beyond a reasonable doubt that they did in fact catch those fish under the J hook or the circle hook. So once they've left the fishing area, then your enforcement is going to end at that point. The commercial circle hook requirements would be not a problem for enforcement because they're in that directed fishery. They're going to be out there and their gear is more concise and more contained, so it would be no problem to the commercial end of it. And the gear removal, the LEC had very strong recommendations for the potential safety of the fishermen, that they be granted leadway, with personal safety being the biggest factor. We feel that the use of certain gear should not be required, but to require to have the gear on board is easily enforceable, but you have to have the leadway as far as those persons using that, whether or not it be safe for that fisherman to release that fish.
Thank you for those comments, Doug. Are there any questions for Doug? Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the Law Enforcement Committee report, Doug. I was a little bit confused when the Law Enforcement Committee was discussing the online training course, and I was having difficulty understanding if the Law Enforcement Committee was recommending that the states require that the online training course be taken, and that the federal permit, in other words, a federal endorsement for recreational fishing, be required by the states as well. It just wasn't clear to me if you all were recommending that or not.
Doug?
Okay. For the federal waters, with taking the course in the online and then printing out some type of certificate and having on board the boat, we were in support of that. Although we wanted to see it more educational based, with going out there rather than requiring it because of the enforceability issues. That we have to have something on board that shows it's unique to that fisherman, that they have it, and then a fisherman that comes out of, say, Maryland, who's fishing off of New Jersey waters, they may encounter different jurisdictions, that we have something that's consistent throughout the states. But it was enforceable that on the federal level, if they were in the federal waters and they had some type of certificate that was printed out to that person, that would be easily enforceable. As far as coming back into the states, that's where our recommendation was that an addendum be made to the HMS, so that this way it covered both state and federal waters, rather than each individual state trying to come up with their own regulations that may be different as you go up and down the coast. Our main goal in all this was to have the highest level of consistency.
Any other questions or comments regarding enforcement? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is looking for some clarification. I thought, and perhaps incorrectly, that anybody who had an HMS permit had to abide by those HMS requirements, regardless of the fishery, whether they were fishing in federal or state waters under that federal HMS permit. Is that correct or not correct?
For the HMS, for the tunas, it is requirement that you're in state or federal waters. For the sharks, there is that exemption in there. If you're fishing in strictly in state waters, then you do not have to have the possession of the HMS permit.
Carol, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, thank you. I just want to clarify, if you have an HMS permit, yes, you are required to follow the federal regulations regardless of whether you are in state waters or federal waters, unless the state has more restrictive regulations. If you are only fishing in state waters and you never go into the federal waters, then you are correct that you only need that for tunas, which we manage all the way to the shore, but for sharks, you do not need a federal permit.
Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just a comment about being able to get a permit online. I think that's a pretty interesting solution, maybe. I'm a shark dealer. I have to physically go to a class so I can ID sharks. I mean, I'm handling them. They're dead when I get them, so maybe it's a handling thing. But I have to physically go to a class. And every 3 years when I have to renew, I have to go back to a class. And I just think it's interesting that the rec guys can go online and print out a certificate, and I've got to drag my butt to class every 3 years. And I don't know if you can change that. It doesn't have anything to do with dusky sharks, but has permitting in general. I've talked about that before, but I don't seem to get anywhere, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Eric, do you have any comment to that, Carol?
Thanks. So yes, we do require that all of our shark dealers go to a class every 3 years where they have hands-on instructions for seeing the sharks. And that is because what the shark dealers are doing, they need to be clear and identify every shark to species on their dealer reports, which is critical for our quota monitoring purposes. Some of our shark species have pretty small quotas, and we need to make sure we're getting the correct identifications. The shark fishermen, there are thousands of them compared to hundreds of the dealers. We would love to be able to require that all shark fishermen, when they go out fishing, get that hands-on requirement, but it's just not possible for the recreational fishery where you're talking about 20, 30,000 people going, some of them just going out once for a weekend. So we are requiring this video now, which shows some of the main features, particularly of the species where important, are critically important at the moment, and those are the ridgeback. So those of you who will remember, I believe it was the Edisto tournament in South Carolina, where fishermen clearly landed ridgeback sharks. It's because they were not aware of the regulations and how to identify ridgeback shark, let alone whether or not those were duskies or sandbars or silky or any of the other ridgeback sharks. So we're trying to, in our endorsement video, trying to point out those indications of what you should not be landing. We do not intend for all the recreational fishermen to become shark experts. Shark dealers, however, they have a commercial stake in this. They should be experts. We are considering other ways. We have heard comments like yours before that it's every 3 years. Shark identification doesn't change that frequently. Maybe we should change it. So we're considering things like that, but at the moment, this is where we stand.
Thank you for that clarification, Carol. Okay, Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
I won't take any more time.
Any other hands? Tom Foti.
Carol, have you thought about, through the chair, have you thought about doing a video for the surf fishermen? I've noticed in the last couple of years there's a lot of clubs that actually have, where they meet at night and they all shark fish. Everything's released, nothing is kept. But the handling of how you handle sharks in the surf would be nice to basically be able to send them to a site. And when I see one of the clubs scheduling some night like this, I say, why don't you go look at the video before you basically do that? It's becoming very popular. I mean, guys do it, and they basically have big gear. Matter of fact, they were doing it for the last 30 years. They were catching a lot of brown sharks in the bays and things like that. But all those sharks are really released. But it'd be nice if you had a handling video that we could basically show them. Because as we're trying in New Jersey, as we demonstrated with summer flounder, we're trying to promote how you handle fish and release them carefully.
Thanks. We would actually love to do a handling and release video. One of the problems we've had with the video we have now for the sharks is some of the anglers, particularly those up off of New England that handle some of our big blue sharks and mako sharks, say that the sharks we're showing in the video are a little too relaxed. They're not the type of sharks they see. They see sharks that are all over the place, struggling to get out, and they are having trouble getting us video of that to put it in. So I would urge you that if you have any video that you would like us to do, get us a request, but then also if you have the video itself, we would love to have it to be able to use.
Tom?
I mean, these guys shoot videos of everything they do nowadays, so if we put out a release and asking some of the clubs that basically when you're doing this, if you shoot a video, please get us into it. We want to use as a training video. We'll look at, of course, you have to use circle hooks. You're going to be abiding by the law as you do that. So we need a instruction. If you help me write up something like that, I get to a bunch of the clubs that do that, and maybe it would help in obtaining footage.
John?
I would just second the need for that kind of handling video. New York State is also seeing an increase in shore fishing for prohibited species like sandbar, sand tiger, that kind of thing, and any positive outreach would be helpful. Thank you.
I would just add that although I'm not aware of a video generated by Delaware, I think they're the only state that has regulations with regard to recreational release of sharks. We'll get into that summary of the states, how the states react to releasing sharks and what guidance they provide in a minute, but I just thought I'd throw that in here now. Are there any further questions or comments on this? Now, seeing none, I'm going to call on Kirby for a report of the technical committee in their review of these federal measures. Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as mentioned, I'm going to go through the technical committee report. First is just some brief background. As you all know, the last time the board met was in May 2017, and there was a request for the board to consider cooperative research with NOAA fisheries to improve the estimates of dusky and other sharks caught in state waters. And the technical committee met via conference call on June 2nd to discuss the provisions of Amendment 5B. I will note that I was not on that call. Carol was, and so she might back me up if I misspeak on any of these points that were raised by the technical committee. So for Amendment 5B, NOAA Fisheries is interested in trying to collect additional fishery-dependent data for future stock assessments, as Carol mentioned. And currently, the shark-dependent data, they're pulling that from 5 commercial vessels that have 100% observer coverage in federal waters. Regarding the gear, they're using bottom line, and they're limited to no more than 300 hooks. So what that means is that for each trip, fishermen can make 2 sets only. The first, no more than 150 hooks can be set, and then on the second set, no more than 300 hooks. Fishermen must keep all dead sharks. That's unless they're prohibited species or the fishing season is closed, and fishermen are allowed to fish for and sell sandbar sharks. So some of the challenges that the technical committee raised regarding extending research into state waters were the following. Fishing for sandbar sharks is prohibited in state waters for many states, and current bottom line gear length may exceed the requirements of short lines that are used to fish for sharks in state waters. Fishermen many times can keep over the commercial retention limits, as well as fishing for coastal sharks based on a quota other than the aggregated large coastal sharks quota is also a problem. And what we mean by that is that the season may be closed for other large coastal shark fishermen. The group discussed the language also in section 4.3.82 regarding the display and research permits of the coastal sharks FMP. And as noted in the document, a state may grant exemptions from the seasonal closure, quota, possession limit, gear restrictions, and prohibited species restrictions contained in the FMP through a state display or through a research permit system. And then states also require NIMS to apply for a research permit, which is not automatically or always easily obtained. So next we have a couple of state-specific notes. So first was from Georgia. Although it's allowed in the coastal sharks FMP, long lines and gill nets are not allowed in state waters. No current commercial fishery is currently taking place, and therefore there was noted not a need for fishery independent data collection. Over 17 plus seasons of fishery independent data collection and no documented dusky sharks have been found in Georgia's territorial waters. 5 species, though, have been encountered. Those are Atlantic sharpnose, bonnethead, blacknose, blacktip, and sandbar sharks. Other state notes were with regards to North Carolina. There were 2 main concerns that were raised regarding shark research in state waters. The first is that North Carolina has a scientific permit application that requires applicants to be affiliated with a research institution. And the second is that accurate reporting of research landings versus commercial landings is somewhat of a problem. Currently, there's 1 North Carolina fisherman who participates and is not affiliated with a research institution. NOAA Fisheries is in turn responsible for the scientific permit, though legally they are not. So from my understanding, the application issue would need to be resolved before the landings issue could be addressed. Highly Migratory Species Division of NOAA will have further discussions with the state of North Carolina on this, and maybe Carol can speak to that if any progress has been made on that. And then lastly, if there's a potential fix regarding the commercial versus research landings, HMS could ask the fishermen to sign an agreement that lets HMS forward the landings data to North Carolina. This would then allow North Carolina to accurately depict commercial and research landings on North Carolina's trip ticket system. So wrapping up additional state notes, we have South Carolina and Virginia and Florida. For South Carolina, the state will allow HMS research fishery, a research fishery in state waters if the individual has a South Carolina scientific research permit. In Virginia and Florida, there was a request made on that call about an allowable gear type in state waters, and if they allow HMS research fishery, if they could allow a research fishery in state waters. I have not heard a word back on that as of yet. Maybe Rob can speak to that. Regarding Florida, they currently have a ban on long line gear and gill nets in state waters, and that will not be lifted for shark research. And last, as noted in the TC report, NOAA has a shark tagging program, and there were some questions on angler participation in that program. South Carolina currently has anglers required to have a scientific research permit to tag a fish, and Florida requires a special activity license for all fish tagging. Massachusetts, Maryland, North Carolina, and Georgia do not require anglers participating in a cooperative tagging effort to have a scientific research permit. So with that, I will take any questions as best I can. Thank you.
Any questions for Kirby? All right. I'm going to call on Kirby again to provide state feedback on the review, and that was through the auspices of a poll, and Kirby will tell us about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. Just as background, as you're aware, there were questions posed to the states following the May board meeting. I'm going to walk through the summary of that feedback that we got from the states. Just to be clear, we received feedback. We set a deadline of May 31st, and we got feedback from the states of New York, south through Florida. They provided responses to those questions. We didn't hear anything from the states north of New York up through Massachusetts or the state of Maine that I'm aware of. So the three questions that were asked were, and a number of them had subcomponents, and I can get into those if there's follow-up questions, but the three questions were, does your state have communication materials currently to address best practices when fishing for sharks from shore or piers? The second question is, does your state require circle hooks when fishing for sharks or other species? And the third was, does your state have measures to maximize gear removal before releasing sharks? So that's either release using a D-hooker or cutting the galleon line less than 3 feet from the hook. So question one, in terms of the responses, they were nearly split. 4 were yes, 5 were no. Some qualified those answers. Nearly all were in favor of the sub-question of requiring communication materials. Many are not interested in making it mandatory. Many noted that the Commission and/or NOAA should help with developing those materials, and material information should be consistent if implemented across all the states. Regarding question 2, does your state require circle hooks? Predominantly, it was a no for most states. That would be New York through Delaware, North Carolina, Georgia through Florida. New Jersey, Delaware, North Carolina, and Florida all require circle hooks for other specific species. Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina regulate short lines for the commercial fishery. And there was a sub-question about whether the Commission should require circle hooks. And this was fairly evenly split in terms of 2 were against, 3 were for, and 4 states either didn't answer or were neutral on the question. And the last main question was, does your state have measures to maximize gear removal? A majority of the states do not. Only 3 states currently have these measures or similar measures in place, and that's New York, Delaware, and Virginia. And just to note, the state-specific responses were included in your meeting materials, so please look through that if you have specific questions on an individual state. But with that, I'll take any questions on my summary. Thank you.
Okay. John, then Michelle.
Thank you. Just a note, I believe New York State does have a circle hook requirement for shark. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll make that noted. Sorry.
Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in terms of circle hooks, I mean, we do require, also, in addition to what was noted in the survey, I mean, we do require the use of circle hooks for the short lines for the coastal sharks fishery, for the commercial sector of the coastal sharks fishery. And then also in our proclamation, which has the force and effect of rule, we do have language that's very similar to Delaware's regulation on the books, where it states it is unlawful to fail to return all sharks not meeting harvest requirements to the water in a manner that ensures the highest likelihood of survival, which I think is very similar to what Delaware has on the books right now. So I just wanted to make those 2 notes.
Thank you for those additions. Any other comments or questions on the poll that was distributed and described by Kirby? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will first start by apologizing to Kirby. So I have an email crafted up. It's well within the realm of possibility that I just never hit send. I'm guessing it is past relevance at this point, but if not, I'd be happy to send it to you. To cut to the chase, I don't think Rhode Island would have tipped the balance in either direction in the poll for the answers you have already, but just mostly wanted to apologize for not responding.
Thank you, Jay. So just to that, if folks have questions on Rhode Island's requirements or answers to those, then you can direct those to Jay and he can answer them in this meeting. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? All right, I guess we'll... Well, the last item under this subheading would be to consider complementary management measures for state waters. And we list possible action for that agenda item. Are there any recommendations from the board? They don't have to be in the form of a motion yet, but any comments or recommendations? Dr. Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it sounds like, just from my reading of all of the survey responses, that most states were, in favor of or amenable to including links on their websites to educational and outreach materials that would link directly to the HMS website in terms of the educational video online. I think, just in terms of making that a requirement, I'm not so sure we would necessarily support making it a requirement or a compliance requirement. I think, my sense, and other states can speak up, is that most folks were amenable to including that information on their website. I do agree with, the states that indicated in terms of providing additional outreach materials for shore or pier-based fishing, recreational fishing for sharks, that we would probably look to the Commission and HMS to take a coordinated approach to developing those materials, just to make sure that there's a consistent educational message going out to all anglers with regard to best practices and safe handling of those sharks. I do have some other comments on the research fishery and complementing that on state waters, but I'll hold off and maybe just tackle these things one thing at a time.
Any response either to Michelle's comments or any comments on this particular topic or suggestions? Rob O'Reilly.
So the correspondence here with Michelle is pretty much the same. The outreach is really good. See from the survey that maybe some states are hoping to be provided the information, but certainly that's supportable. Putting as a requirement based on the feedback that I heard from the advisor, at least the director of the advisory committee, is that all along most of the states were not looking for that. So I think that probably my comments are very similar, and I won't wait to talk about the research part, but I know that Kirby asked me about that earlier, mentioned that I might address that, and I think other than long line, Kirby, I think that that's probably the gear that's prohibited. So just wanted to add that now, if I may.
Thank you. In thinking about this prior to the meeting, I decided there's 3 possible courses of action. Obviously, the default is do nothing additional. A second course of action would be, as Michelle suggested, having voluntary access to educational materials, a link on states' websites, linking to the federal guidance in this regard. And then the third option would be some sort of mandatory compliance. Thus far, the only comments I've heard from anyone, and Robert, I'll get to you in just a second, would be for the second alternative, namely voluntary compliance, with perhaps a common message available. Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The state of South Carolina has long adopted a policy of complementary management, specifically for sharks in state waters, for a variety of reasons. I must point out to the board, however, that our legislature has been very, very clear in terms of recreational angling requirements. And I should preface this to say that we have required a saltwater recreational fishing license since the early 1990s. I believe we're one of the first states to do so on the East Coast. But I'd like to read from the code, the South Carolina Code. However, no federal recreational angling permit or federal charter boat headboat permit is required for the taking or possession of sharks in the waters of the state. So our General Assembly has made a very, very strong policy statement with regard to federal permitting requirements in state waters. And insofar as I represent the state of South Carolina, I think it's, and given South Carolina's history vis-a-vis federalism, I think it'd be just helpful for the board to make note of that. But having said that, I think the idea of complementary management measures, both from ease of compliance as well as making accessible those educational materials, is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Any other comments or suggestions? Well, do the states feel they have sufficient guidance at this point to press forward with this issue? Michelle.
Well, I'm not shy. Again, we don't have any problem with providing links to the materials that HMS has produced on our website. You know, we'd be happy to do so. I think, you know, perhaps receiving, if that link could be emailed directly, you know, to us. We just want to make sure that we're providing the appropriate link to those materials. And then, as I said, you know, we are absolutely supportive of additional materials that would assist anglers who are fishing from piers or from shore. You know, our concern is just that whatever we are linking to, everybody's linking to the same information so that it is a consistent educational message. So I think from North Carolina's perspective, we have no problem moving forward and providing links on our website to the videos that the Highly Endangered Species Division has already produced.
Thank you. Assuming this is the path forward for us, Carol, could you provide the exact links to everyone, to every coastal state, so that make sure that in our educational materials they reach the right source?
Yes, we are actually putting the video along with our questions up on our permit webpage for educational purposes, so anybody can go to the permit webpage and see the video and take the questions. And that will happen when we make the switch over to issuing 2018 permits. So that should be November timeframe. So anyone will be able to watch the video, take the questions. The answers to the questions have links to all of our materials. The question that I have for all of you actually is, I'm hearing some messages that you would like consistent, or at least some of the states would like consistent shore and pier-based best practices, which I'm all in favor for. So the question is more of, is that really what I'm hearing, and how do we start that process?
Yeah, that's the question, is who will tailor-made this advice for shore and pier fishing? But obviously, we're not going to resolve that just at this particular juncture, but certainly Carol can provide the linkage to the federal websites, at least for vessels fishing in internal waters for sharks, and it'll be up to the states to provide links to that information provided in their education and outreach materials. I'm not hearing any consensus or any suggestions even towards making that mandatory, but it appears to be a voluntary compliance measure. Are there any differing opinions on that, or is everyone pretty much on the same page that it should be voluntary? I'm seeing some heads nod for the voluntary. Any feel otherwise on that? All right, thank you. Michelle, I think you wanted to raise another issue as well, did you not?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, just I think a couple things. I think one of the other, questions that was raised was, and I think that NOAA Fisheries has requested complementary measures for, is the use of circle hooks when fishing for sharks. And as I indicated, that's already a requirement for the commercial fishery in North Carolina when, fishing on coastal sharks within state waters. That's already a requirement of our proclamation. We do have concerns, which for folks who read through the materials would have seen with regard to having a circle hook requirement for recreational fishermen. I think this is reflective of what the law enforcement committee pointed out. The issue is determining targeting, and our concern was also that anglers are likely to be much more receptive to a positive encouragement to use circle hooks as part of best handling practices when fishing for certain species, as opposed to making this a mandatory compliance element. So I think I just want to reiterate that's where North Carolina stands on the circle hook issue, that we would prefer to provide positive encouragement rather than making that a mandatory requirement within state waters. I think the folks who are engaged in directed fishing for sharks in federal waters, those are folks who are really shark fishermen, and that's what they plan to go out and do. And I think for a lot of anglers fishing within state waters, they're not looking necessarily to target sharks. I'm not saying everybody, but they're not necessarily looking to target sharks. And so if they happen to pull up a shark, and are faced with the compliance of having to use a circle hook, we're just concerned that that's actually going to have a negative impact in terms of angler attitude. So thank you. It sounds like Robert wants to speak to that point, and then I'll come back to the research permit.
All right, I'll call on Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Duvall said it very, very well. I mean, in addition to sharks, there are a number of species that we're watching now that we are developing and have developed best practices for. Circle hooks are a very, very big part of that. Leader lengths, fixed weights, those kinds of things, in the red drum fishery, for instance. And so we already have a very vibrant outreach campaign now, and certainly think that this is in keeping. I agree with Dr. Duvall's comments. Concerned about targeting specifically, a recreational fisherman fishing in state waters. Could be out shark fishing, could be out red drum fishing, could be flounder fishing. And I think it makes it a very difficult, it puts our law enforcement division in a very difficult spot in terms of looking at those violations. The last thing I'd like to say is, we have found good success in terms of engaging the recreational anglers as partners in stewardship and conservation with these voluntary measures as opposed to mandatory measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Any further comments? I take it by the fact that no one has additional comments that there's no one that feels that circle hooks, for instance, should be mandatory in state waters for fishing for sharks, but that no one would oppose any given jurisdiction from providing additional outreach materials recommending circle hooks when fishing for sharks. Is that a fair summarization of the general feelings of the board? I'm not seeing any negative responses, so I'll take that as a positive. Have we covered everything on this particular agenda item? Is there anything further we need to take care of? Okay. There was a public comment, and I think it was on this agenda item. Would you come forward, identify yourself, Katie? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Westfall. I'm the Senior Manager of Highly Migratory Species Advocacy at the Environmental Defense Fund and a member of the Coastal Sharks Advisory Panel. I appreciate the opportunity to provide public comment today on this agenda item and strongly support the Commission adopting complementary management measures to Highly Migratory Species Amendment 5B, which aims to end the overfishing of dusky sharks and rebuild their population. It sounded like there was interest in voluntary measures, but specifically, we'd like to strongly encourage the Commission to require that anglers fishing for sharks obtain a shark endorsement, including the completion of an online shark identification and fishing regulation training course. As you know, at least 19 shark species are prohibited in both the federal fishery and according to the ASMFC Coastal Shark Plan, including dusky sharks. Unfortunately, many sharks caught intentionally and accidentally in recreational fisheries fall into this prohibited group. Over the past decade, on the East Coast alone, 1.2 million prohibited sharks were caught in both state and federal waters, along with an additional 17.5 million sharks that were reported as unidentified because anglers either did not or could not identify at the species level. While some of these sharks will survive after release, many will die after being mistakenly landed or mishandled because anglers do not know fishing regulations, safe handling release practices, or how to identify the species. The landing of dusky sharks, for example, has been prohibited since 2000, but overfishing continues. Recreational fishing in state and federal waters represents the largest source of interactions with dusky sharks by an order of magnitude, highlighting the need for increased stewardship by anglers. For a species like dusky sharks, which is prohibited due to its vulnerable life history characteristics, even low levels of mortality harm their population and hamper recovery efforts. Recent research suggests that anglers themselves underappreciate the impact they can have with catch and release fishing, and at the same time, studies indicate that education efforts that train fishermen to safely handle and release sharks can reduce the amount of mortality that occurs after release. So it's particularly important that the Commission takes action to adopt complementary measures to this endorsement because tens of thousands of individuals fish for sharks from boats, piers, and shorelines on the East Coast. Indeed, this estimate may be low by an order of magnitude as these numbers are not currently known. As noted in a recent study, it's also important to recognize that land-based shark fishing has the potential to cause more stress to sharks as they're dragged over rough terrain onto the shore without the buoyant support of water. This type of handling makes sharks more susceptible to injury and less likely to survive if released. Requiring an endorsement and related training would increase the ability of anglers to correctly identify dusky and other prohibited sharks, comply with regulations, and safely handle and release these sharks. Thus, adopting this measure would aid in the rebuilding of the dusky shark population. Further, these measures would help to improve the data for the recreational sector in state waters, as it would increase the chances that anglers are correctly identifying shark species. It would also help to identify the universe of fishermen who are targeting sharks, which could provide a population to sample from in order to improve recreational estimates for dusky and other sharks. In addition to the shark endorsement, we recommend that states expand outreach and educational efforts to recreational fishermen in state waters, which could include trainings and workshops. In order to implement such an effort at a minimal cost, states could use the NIMS-produced outreach materials that we talked about today. In addition to those materials, it was heartening to hear the support for the development of shore-based fishing best handling practices, as that's currently missing. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this important issue and for your consideration of the recreational shark endorsement.
Thank you, Katie. Are there any questions or comments to direct to Katie before she walks back? Seeing none, thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to the next to last agenda item, and that is the setting the 2018 specifications for shark fishing. I'm going to call on Kirby initially to tee that up for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to actually pass it down to Carol, who has a PowerPoint ready for it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will be really fast on this. This is in regard to our proposed rule for quotas, opening dates, retention limits for the 2018 Atlantic shark commercial fishing season. I am focusing only on the Atlantic region. So we issued a proposed rule in August. Real short summary, this proposed rule proposes the exact same thing that we implemented in 2017. So the exact same quotas all around, which means that Atlantic smoothhound sharks, which is essentially smooth dogfish in the Atlantic, has an increase because they underharvested the quota. Everybody else has the base quota that we have set up. We are proposing opening all shark management groups on January 1st. We're proposing that the large coastal retention limit be 25 sharks other than sandbar per vessel per trip. If the quota is going really fast at the beginning of the year, we would reduce the retention limit probably to about 3. That's what we did this year. Come July 15th or so, we will increase it back up to 36 is what we proposed. This is pretty much exactly the same that we did this year, and except for a couple modifications in the retention limits, the same that we did in 2016. Both in 2016 and 2017, the large coastal fishery continued through the entire year. So we are not expecting it to close at this point. Comment period ended on September 21st. We did not receive any comments opposed to this. We did not receive any comments from any of the states. We had a couple comments from people generally about shark fishing, some people who don't like shark fishing at all and wanted us to close all commercial fisheries, and some people who were supportive of having quotas but were concerned about the enforcement. Other than that, all the comments we received were in favor of what we proposed for the Atlantic. And we are working on the final rule. Here are all the numbers in really small font, so I'm not going to read it to you. You can look at it on your own. Thank you.
Any questions for Carol? Seeing none, I'll look to the board for a possible motion. Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Carol. And as I stated last year, it's really important that over time, NOAA has been able to allow other states to enjoy the fishery, and that's certainly the case in Virginia. We're very happy about that. With the variable possession limits, that's made all the difference. And after July 15th, we are able to pursue some sharks, which is good. So thank you again. And my motion is move to approve the 2018 coastal shark specifications via an email vote after the NOAA Fisheries publishes the final rule for the 2018 Atlantic shark commercial fishery season. And this is not a precedent. This has happened before where we've had the email vote.
Are there anyone care to offer a second? First hand I saw, is that Tom Baum? Tom? Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, are we ready for a vote? Is there a need to caucus? All right. Is there any opposition to approving this motion? Seeing none, I assume it's approved as offered. Thank you. Last agenda item is we need to elect a vice chair. Does anyone have a suggestion? Spud.
I would like to nominate Patrick Gear for vice chair of the Coastal Sharks Board.
Is there a second? Robert? Any further nominations? Seeing none, congratulations, Pat. You're the new vice chair. All right, is there any other business to come before the Shark Board? Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry not to go back to a previous issue, but I just wanted to make a quick comment on the shark research fishery and, the request by HMS to develop cooperative research opportunities in state waters, and I know we've struggled with this in North Carolina a little bit because of our regulations, and it is in regulation that we do require, you know, a scientific or academic institution to be the holder of that permit, just so that we do not have individuals applying to do quote unquote research. We just want to make sure that, you know, that there is valid scientific research being done. So I don't anticipate that those regulations will change. So we're going to have to try to work towards some solution. But because, you know, we do want to support those types of research activities in state waters where we can. You know, I did note that, you know, we do have one individual who participates in that fishery right now, and there was a researcher from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, I think a Mr. Milliken, who did obtain one of our scientific and educational collection permits in order to work with this individual. So, you know, perhaps Carol and HMS staff can look into that, and a similar solution can be found. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that suggestion and comment, Michelle. Anything further for the good of the Shark Board? Tony.
Not necessarily for the Shark Board, but I did want to make an introduction, who I haven't even made myself an introduction yet, but some of you may remember Najee Lazar. He used to work for the state of Rhode Island, and now he is at the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center, and he is here with a delegation of folks from Ghana, including their Deputy Minister and their Director of Fisheries, and they are here to learn about the commission and our process. They too have a fisheries commission that they are working to get together to work on rebuilding their fishery resources, and they're here to just learn about our process. They will be here tonight with us at the annual dinner. So I don't know if you gentlemen want to stand up so folks can see you, or just say hello. Please make sure folks introduce yourselves. And let them know how our commission works. And that is it. I think we'll start EL on time at 2:30.
Welcome, and if there's nothing further, I guess we're adjourned. Thank you.